Hi guys, I think we're going to do a little bit of a review because I've been looking at the grades on the quizzes and looking at some of the projects that are being turned in, and I think I need to make a better job of explaining some of this stuff. First of all, I want to look at the question that we had on the quiz concerning unity. This is from the lecture on the principles. There is no consensus on the principles, just like on the elements. We are going with the principles that are listed in our White Space is Not Your Enemy book. And if you look at the principles, you will see that we had different books giving us different principles. Our book uses emphasis, contrast, balance, movement, rhythm and pattern, and unity. Another book only lists hierarchy, which would be the same as emphasis, alignment, which is balance, and unity. And balance, contrast, direction, which is movement, dominance, which is hierarchy, proportion, which is like, well, actually proportion would be possibly part of movement, could be, well, it's just a little bit different, and unity. If you look at these, the only one that's agreed on is unity. Everybody agrees that there is a unity among the work, then it's using good design principles. So that was maybe a little bit of a trick question, but that is the only thing that is agreed on. The next thing that I wanted to look at was the question over these two images that I asked you, how do these two examples demonstrate movement? And in your book, if you look in your book, right there, there's the list that you choose from for how these images show movement. Diagonal lines, look at this. This is a strong diagonal. This is a strong diagonal. Curving S line. This S takes us back and goes into, let me enlarge this. Do you see how we show movement by following the S curve? Motion blur. Look at the motion in here because we're using motion blur, which makes it look like the person on the bicycle is moving. Now, one of the oddball things about that is it also makes it look like the building in the background is moving, which is no. So it's a little bit odd, but it does show movement nonetheless. We have depth of field. We have items that are close to us and items that are far away. Particularly in this image, you can see good depth of field. A depth of field is also called perspective, so that items that are closer to you are larger and items that are further away from you are smaller. And you can see we have depth of field going on in both of these images, quite honestly. If you read principle number 4 on movement, lines can create movement. Different kinds of linear movement tend to communicate different kinds of symbolic messages. Horizontal lines communicate movement flow left to right or right to left. Verticals indicate stability, like trees and tall buildings. Vertical lines can have inspirational upward movement like mountain peaks, or downward movement such as waterfalls. Diagonal lines communicate exciting dynamic movement. Curving lines, distance or meandering movement. The next problem that I wanted to look at was there seems to be a misunderstanding about focal points. Rule number 1 about focal points: have one. Without a focal point, the viewer doesn't know what to look at first. If you're trying to capture viewers' attention and control the way their eye moves across the layout, then you need a focal point. Rule number 2 about focal points: limit one per screen or page or story or ad. Without a focal point, the eye wanders aimlessly around the layout. If you have 2 focal points, then you don't have any focal point. You can clump several items together to form one focal point, but you have one focal point. It should be the most eye-catching piece of visual information. The book goes on with the focal point becomes so because it sits in a pool of negative space, or the curve of line in the layout leads to the focal point, or the focal point's shape makes it stand out, or its size, or it's lighter, or it's darker. It becomes the focal point because it uses contrast. The next thing I wanted to go over again was symmetrical balance. The placemats you were designing needed to have symmetrical balance. Symmetrical balance means that it's the same from side to side, folded over, mirror image, not merely repeated, but mirror. The tree up here is a great example of a mirror image. Yin Yang gets a little complicated because the imagery tends to really reflect and reflect again, so it's really a little bit off from being pure symmetrical. The fleur-de-lis is a better example of a purely symmetrical balance. The horizontal axis can be a little more complicated for the viewer to read as being symmetrical. Remember, we usually reserve symmetrical balance for something that is more formal, like wedding invitations and greeting cards. It is not always the most exciting layout, so sometimes designers will call it a little bit Mickey Mouse. But remember, symmetrical, you fold down the middle and it's going to be the same on either side. Asymmetrical balance can be a little more interesting because you can play with the fulcrum, but I specifically asked for a symmetrical design. If you were asked to redo it, please redo and resubmit. Also, if you did not give me the original sketches, I need to have those. The next submission was for 2 images with more detail, and now out of those 2 images that you submitted to me, you are going to pull one of those and make a highly detailed completed image out of one of those 2. So at this point you should pull out all the stops and make the design as intricate as you want and submit that one to me. That will be your final comprehensive design for that assignment.